I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by retired Colonel Grant Newsham, currently serving as a corporate and governmental advisor and lecturer on Asia-Pacific defense matters and business risks posed by organized crime, money laundering, and political instability. Grant currently serves as a senior research fellow at the Japan Forum for Strategic Studies and has prior experience in risk management for Morgan Stanley Japan, security management at Motorola Japan, and U.S. Foreign Service work in Washington, D.C. and Tokyo. Grant retired at the rank of colonel in 2014 following a remarkable 30-year career in the United States Marine Corps Reserve and holds a Juris Doctor from UCLA. So Grant, welcome, sir. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, glad to be here. Thanks very much.
Well, I also always thank veterans for their career of service. So let me thank you for that as well. And I want to get right into your new book, When China Attacks, A Warning to America. So the title is self-explanatory, but I want to play things safe by asking you to describe the key premise of the book and really what inspired you to write this.
Sure. Well, the title has two possible meanings. One is a future tense. It's when China attacks in the future, or it could be something that is already happening or happened. And that's the basis of the book. It's the latter interpretation, is that China has already been attacking us. We don't recognize it as warfare, but they've been attacking us on a number of fronts for 30 plus years now. And as I said, we don't recognize it that way. The Chinese do. And it's all intended to weaken us, set us up for a so-called eventual kinetic attack. And that's just the word they use these days for actually shooting people. Why I actually wrote the book, well, one, I was asked to write it, was one thing. But two, I've been looking at this topic, the Asia-Pacific and China, for about 40 plus years now. So you get a few ideas, and I've seen it from different perspectives: the military, the diplomatic work, investment banking, and the high-tech industry. And it gives you a perspective. And I just thought I would give my take about what the Chinese have been doing, what they intend to do to us, what happens if we lose, and also what we can do about it. And that was the idea. One way to look at it, I tell people, is if you consider that spy balloon that came over the U.S. a few months ago, and somebody in Montana, say, looked up, or anywhere looked up and said, what is going on? What's the deal with China? Well, this book kind of answers those questions. And it's fortuitous, I suppose, but it is intended for people who don't live and breathe the subject, but have an interest in it. But also people who do live and breathe it might find a few ideas in there that I presume they would either agree with or else would be outraged by. But that's the nature of writing a book.
Yeah. Well, and I think the spy balloon was definitely a shot across the bow for most Americans, right? I mean, I think, having basically this foreign surveillance object over American airspace, I mean, it traversed the entire country. I think that probably shocked a lot of Americans. And so on that note, I want to delineate for the audience that really what we're discussing today is the Chinese Communist Party and their political leadership, and really how the nation states interact with each other. And I don't want to cast any aspersions towards the Chinese people. They have a wonderful culture filled with brilliant, hardworking people who deserve our respect. And so really, I want to try and focus things in on, the national tensions, I guess. And I think that's what you're addressing in your book, rather than anything negative towards a culture or a group of people.
Well, it's the regime. It's the Chinese regime, just as we've seen similar regimes like this in our lifetime, and go back in history. And this sort of regime is not new. And it is an important distinction to make. And I do make it. It's really a question of what the Chinese Communist Party is doing to China and is doing to us and intends to do to the rest of the world. Actually, if it had anything to do with Chinese people in general, well, my goodness, just go to Taiwan and you'll see what China could be. So it is a question of the CCP and its behavior.
Yeah. Well, so let's get into gray zone warfare. I've spoken in the past with several defense analysts who contend, as you do, that China is already at war with the West. But again, instead of using bullets, they're relying on economic and political strategies to win without an open conflict. Is that kind of the approach that you're taking in this book, I guess?
Well, that's not far off. As I said, the Chinese have been conducting warfare as they see it, but not as we see it. What does that look like? Well, economic warfare. If you can get your main enemy, and that is what the Chinese Communist parties have described us as, they always have, and they still do. If you can get them to ship a good chunk of their manufacturing industry over to you to help you build your economy and build your military in the process, well, that's a very good thing. If you can put, say, 3.5 million of his people who worked in factories, put them out of jobs, well, that's a good thing. It's a plus for China. It's not good for us, obviously. And you create a dependency on the part of your main enemy. Think of the products that we are dependent on for China, pharmaceuticals, some materials that are essential for our defense. If you can create that, well, that's a win. And you haven't had to shoot anybody. Additionally, you have biological warfare, chemical warfare, drug warfare, for example, the fentanyl scourge that killed 70,000 Americans last year. Compare that to the 12 years of Vietnam that only killed 55,000 Americans. That vast majority of it comes from China. They could stop it in an afternoon, but they don't. And we don't consider it an act of war for some reason. There's cyber warfare that has stolen our military, commercial technologies, most sensitive information, secrets that we have. Proxy warfare, that's getting Americans to do your work for you. Well, which of these actually involve shooting? Not many of them. In fact, none of them do. Some of them do involve death and killing, but not shooting as we see it. So America has decided that it is not at war with China. China very much sees itself in a war with us. And these are the things that are sometimes referred to as gray zone activities. And another good example of that would be China, Chinese Communist Party seizing basically de facto control of the entire South China Sea. That is mostly international waters. And it's about 1.5 times the size of the Mediterranean Ocean. It's absolutely strategic maritime territory. They've effectively taken it over. And regardless of what international law says, regardless of what international tribunals have ruled, regardless of what every country around the South China Sea and many not around the South China Sea have said, they've gone ahead and done it. Well, is that cause to go to war? Maybe not, certainly how we've interpreted it, but at the same time, it has put China in a position of having seized some strategic terrain, and once again, without firing a shot. So there's been a lot of things going on, and none of them have involved shooting just yet, while we've sort of been asleep while it's been taking place.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and this is a little bit off my questions list, but I understand that China has contentions with India, on the I guess this would be their western front, right? And so they have some border disputes with India. Obviously, there are issues with Nepal, and so the West is not the only country that they're having trouble with in terms of the territorial acquisitions.
Oh, that's right. And Japan as well has been under constant pressure from the Chinese Coast Guard, Chinese maritime militia, Chinese fishing boats, and the Chinese military for well over the last decade now. There's parts of Japanese territory down south that China claims are theirs, and that they will intend to take them when the time is right.
Okay. Well, and actually, before we move on, I should mention Australia as well, right? And I think Australia during the pandemic, they had again real contention. It seemed like there was saber rattling, I guess, at the very least, that came into play. Although, from what I understand, that seems to have kind of calmed down a bit in the last year. So,
just a bit, but
yeah,
it's the problem has not gone away. It's just a question of tactics.
Well, so Taiwan, as you've written, will be the flashpoint for open hostilities. And this is something that, from my reading, it seems like there's almost complete universal agreement on this. China has made it clear that they want to reintegrate Taiwan. They have pressured other countries to not recognize Taiwan's independence, right? They maintain that this is a part of China. And, that was an incentive for overflying the boundary zone in the Taiwan Strait. They were saying, well, we didn't overfly any boundary zone because this is part of our country, right? Um, so what I have seen mixed opinions on is whether there is going to be a use of force or some kind of coercion, or even I've seen people say that they'll just try a soft power strategy and try and win over the hearts and minds of the people of Taiwan to reintegrate. What are your thoughts on the strategy for Taiwan?
Sure. Well, first, I would note that the PRC cannot reintegrate Taiwan because it's never controlled Taiwan. In all of Chinese history, going back some time, there's only been about a decade during the Qing dynasty when a Chinese administration or regime had any sort of control over Taiwan. That's about a decade. It was in the 17th century. And that regime, that administration, the Qings, were not even Chinese. But the Chinese have gotten people to think, many people, to think, well, it's used to be Taiwan used to be part of China, so what's the big deal? They just want to so-called reunite, even though it's never been part of China. And that is very effective psychological warfare to get people to think the way you want them to, even though it has no basis in fact. But to the question of what's coming, I've heard at least a dozen good scenarios of what might play out in China, and there's probably a few dozen more. If anyone tells you exactly what is going to happen, well, ask them who's going to win the Super Bowl next year. They'll probably tell you, but they'll probably be wrong. But
Yeah,
there are some. So I always want to caveat that because people who follow this, you should always be thinking about what you think. But what I think is likely to happen, just my take on it, I think the key date that is coming up is January 2024. That is when Taiwan has an election, a presidential election. If the candidate from the party that is soft on China wins, China just might back off and expect that person to bring Taiwan into the fold, however unwillingly. They might even try to be nice for a bit to show that they really aren't a big threat. And that's how it might play out. China would prefer to get Taiwan without shooting. Who wouldn't? It'd be much, much easier from that perspective. But if a candidate from the party that wants nothing to do with Chinese mainland or Chinese communist control and domination, if they win, at that point, I think an assault becomes very likely because China, I think, will see that it has no prospects of ever luring people on Taiwan back into or sort of back to Chinese domination. I just don't see that happening. So I think the shoot up could happen in 2020. Early 2024 is an important date to watch. Could China launch an assault on Taiwan and think they might have a chance of success? I think so. I think the People's Liberation Army's capabilities have advanced to the point that they could think that they have a real shot at going after Taiwan and taking it. But they will, of course, look very closely at what they think the Americans might do and America's friends. What might they do? That goes into the equation as well. But analysts do differ over all of this. And there's, as I said, there's different scenarios. One could be, say, China just seizes some small offshore islands that belong to Taiwan. It could be part of an economic blockade that strangles Taiwan. Others say it to just go all out against Taiwan. And my assessment is that if China does go against Taiwan sort of kinetically using force, I think they'll go all out. I think they have learned some lessons from what's happened in Ukraine with that fight, and they will try not to make those mistakes. But they will, as I said, they'll pay close attention to what's going on in the United States, what the nature of the administration is. Does it look confused? Does it have too much to handle? Does it seem to lack backbone? They're going to look at all of these things before making a decision. Beijing itself may not know exactly what it's going to do, and it may be waiting to see how things develop, but it has certainly set up or developed the military capability to cause no end of trouble for Taiwan and for us as well. You also mentioned the subversion, the political warfare that's been going on against Taiwan. That is very much part of the deal. And that's been going on for decades. And it has been fairly successful. Taiwan's society, just like any consensual or democratic society, it has plenty of opinions floating around. And consider that in the last presidential election, probably 40% of the voters voted for candidates who would be considered soft on China. So that is, as I said, it's part of the equation. Taiwan has been playing that, had to deal with that for a long time. China's been playing that card very hard for a long time. There's plenty of what you would call fifth columnists in Taiwan, and presumably special forces that have been put in and more that could be coming. And all of this, as I say, is part of a potential fight for Taiwan. You'll see a number of sort of factors and forces applied should such a thing happen.
Well, and it's interesting that you mentioned that. It is definitely not a clear cut, us versus them with China and Taiwan. One of the things that I learned earlier in the year is that Taiwan Semiconductor, for example, has a lot of manufacturing on mainland China. And so there are a lot of basically cross-border business relationships between these two nations, right? So there are definitely a lot that I think both governments have to take into account in terms of that. And obviously one of the things is they would probably want to preserve as much infrastructure, as much business as possible, right? I mean, there's no point to retaking it if they destroy everything, right? That would be kind of a token victory. So that's one of the reasons that one of the past analysts I've talked to had said they really want to pursue the hearts and minds strategy. And I believe that person was saying that, for instance, this Taiwan Semiconductor partnership, right, where they're manufacturing on the mainland, this is one example of China trying to reach out and just gently embrace Taiwan and say, look, life is better if you join us,
Well, they've been trying that for a long time. And during the previous administration of President Ma, they were actually having some success, particularly with Ma himself, who there were some real doubts as to whether or not he wanted to defend Taiwan. But I think the chances of Taiwan falling prey or victim to an appeal to their hearts and minds, those are very slim. If you go to Taiwan, just listen, but also read assessments that have been done. Almost nobody wants life under Chinese communist rule. There may be different reasons for saying, well, there's nothing else we can do, but nobody wants that. The chances of winning, or very few people do, the chances of actually winning Taiwan based on just hearts and minds, I think that is very slim. The business dealings between Taiwan and the mainland, those are indeed, they are deep and longstanding. And the business class in Taiwan is, in some respects, they don't want to upset things and would settle for limitations on their freedoms in exchange for that. But that's the case with us as well. But I would also suggest that the business Taiwan does with mainland China doesn't really, I don't think it's a decisive point when China thinks about what it's going to do. And why? And but I've heard the argument that, well, they want to take TSMC and the semiconductor factories intact with their human capital as well. I've heard that, and it's, I understand it, but I would suggest that even if there were no semiconductors in Taiwan, that it would still be an incredibly juicy target for the Chinese communists. How so? Well, from a military perspective, if you take Taiwan, you have just breached the first island chain defenses. And that refers to a string of islands from Japan to Taiwan to the Philippines down to Malaysia that effectively blocks in, it hems in the People's Liberation Army as it tries to get out into the Pacific. Think of it as a big wall. If you've taken Taiwan, you're in the mid, you've breached it. That's like the walls of a castle being breached. From there, the Chinese Communist Party's army, the PLA, has really easy access, free access eastward into the Pacific. Swing north and you can surround Japan. Swing to the south and you can block Australia off from Asia, from the U.S. And China has its objectives actually are to dominate the entire Pacific and beyond. But from a just military perspective, Taiwan is very useful to have. And that alone would be reason to take it, in my opinion. But also think of the political psychological effect of Beijing seizing Taiwan and, enslaving it. There's no other nice word. But taking it, it would demonstrate that the U.S. military couldn't keep 23 million people free. U.S. financial and economic pressure didn't make any difference. What's that deal about the dollar being so important?
You know,
Well, didn't seem to. And then the third one is nuclear weapons couldn't stop them. Our nukes didn't have any effect. Who else is going to follow or listen to an American promise of protection after that? So as I see it, you combine those things, and it gives maybe some insights into Chinese thinking and objectives.
Yeah, and let me apologize for interrupting a moment ago. One of the things that I've heard in the past is that Xi Jinping has, to some degree, made this a part of his platform as president or leader of the Chinese Communist Party, and so he has committed himself to a greater or lesser degree to reintegrating Taiwan, as he calls it, much in the same way that I think Putin is committed to Ukraine. Right. And so there's definitely a greater objective, from a political sense that may continue to drive that.
Oh, I think so. It very much matters what the leaders of these kind of regimes think. And sometimes that's all that matters is what they think, and we would do well to listen to them. A couple of people who've do very good work on that is Matt Pottinger, who used to be with the National Security Council. And he and John Pomfret, the former Washington Post bureau chief in Beijing for many years, recently have written on this and other things as well. But it's not hard to get a sense of what Xi Jinping thinks. And he has said that China's not going to wait forever, and it's willing to use force. And I think we do well to take him at his word, or at least be ready for it.
Well, so on that perspective, and since you've mentioned Ukraine, I've mentioned Ukraine. Right now, the United States is supporting Ukraine in resisting the Russian invasion, and it's a bit of a distraction for us politically. I've also heard that it is straining our munitions supply chain, right? And obviously that won't last forever. We can scale that up and replenish those munitions, but temporarily there is a strain, from what I understand. So I'm not an expert on this, but having rivals on both sides of the ocean simultaneously reminds me in some ways of the buildup to World War II. It seems like there's a parallel with Russia and China, and then the World War II, Germany and Japan. Do you think that there's a comparison here? And do you think that the current situation with the distraction and everything going, to our east, do you think that may embolden China towards Taiwan?
I think it does. One back to does it look like World War II? It'd be nice, or the run up to World War II. It'd be nice if there were more people who are about 120 years old still alive, because they'd probably tell you, look, if you listen to what's being said and written today, and if you look at what was said and written in 1938, just change the word Taiwan for Czechoslovakia, and you wouldn't know when it was written. Change the word, say, Germany for China, and you wouldn't know the difference. That's how similar it seems to me. To the question of Ukraine being a distraction, I think it certainly is. It's probably a truism that, well, it is a truism that really a government can only handle so many things at once, so many big problems at one time. And the more Ukraine is a distraction, a drain on our resources, drain on just our sort of mental capacity, that the better it is from Beijing's perspective. And they like to see America overextended. And it does weigh in to their calculations. And should they decide to make a move, I think we can very much expect Mr. Putin to cooperate. I think you could expect North Korea to do something that causes us and the Japanese and the South Koreans to focus on that. Wouldn't be surprised if the Iranians did something in the Middle East, which America can't just walk away from. Wouldn't maybe Cuba as well, perhaps Venezuela. Just have to make a move, something that's a distraction. And you can imagine America having to handle with, say, 3 or 4, maybe 5 big problems at once, in addition to everything it's got going domestically, the political turmoil, the inflation, the financial different problems. All of that means that you cannot focus on Taiwan, defense of Taiwan, if you're looking at it from Beijing's perspective. And when the Russian invasion of Ukraine started, actually, there was reports that a deal had been cut between the Russians and the Chinese, that China would support Russia And when the time came, it was expected that Russia would return the favor. And this was particularly mentioned in terms of political, diplomatic, and propaganda support for Russia. That was specifically mentioned, and it was orders went out that Chinese outlets would not say anything negative about Russia. And it was because when the time comes to settle the Taiwan matter once and for all, we expect Russia to return the favor. So it's not just a game of one-on-one, but there's sort of a 3 or 4 dimensional struggle that we're facing, I think.
Yeah, well, and as Germany and Japan were actually in World War II, right? I mean, they were the best way that I've heard it described is they were kind of fair weather friends, right? They had independent goals that really had little relation to each other, but they realized that they were stronger if they both pursued them at the same time. And so Germany was going after Europe, and Japan was going after its Asia Pacific goals. And to me, that's why the parallel seems so strong.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. And there's a shared strategic interest from both China and Russia. And that is they both hate the United States and see the U.S. really as the one obstacle that prevents them from domination of their particular areas. Of course, there's no great love between the Russians and the Chinese in a general sense. But for now, they'll put that on hold. Because certainly the Chinese think that large parts of the Russian Far East were taken from China back when it was weak in the, say, 18th, 19th century. And when the time comes, they will get it back. That's, I think everyone knows it. One imagines Mr. Putin wakes up every morning expecting to find 5 Shenzhens on his side of the border there. But for now, as I say, the strategic interests are different. They align, and it is directed towards the U.S., towards the free world.
Well, so going to this China-Russia, I guess the way that I described it was almost like a new axis, I guess, and perhaps that's too strong a word, but China recently has been talking with Russia about replacing the petrodollar with the yuan, at least for Russian interactions. So they'll be doing this with Russia. I've heard that Saudi Arabia has at least considered going along with this. Do you think that this could be an attempt to undermine the stability of the U.S. dollar, or is this simply a move that their government believes will benefit the Chinese people?
Well, they're going after the U.S. dollar. The dollar is the one last club that we have to use against China. They're defenseless when it comes to that. The RMB is not convertible, the Chinese currency. It's not freely convertible, which means it's like going to a high school fair and you buy tickets and you can go on the rides and get cotton candy, but go away from the high school and try to buy something and nobody wants it. And that effectively is the RMB. So if China wants to pay for things, say the Belt and Road initiatives, if it wants to buy Australian iron ore to make steel to build its navy, it needs to pay in dollars. If it needs to, say, buy Ivy League professors, well, they insist on payments in dollars as well. And China hasn't got half of the foreign currency it needs to meet all of its requirements. So if you are dependent on dollars, you can see the problem it has for Beijing if they can get people to accept their money, and nobody ever does it willingly. You only do it when you have no choice, or it's not going to make any difference really, and you think you might get something better from China out of it. But it is a Achilles heel. It's something more than that, and it's a huge vulnerability. So what they're trying to do is to, as you noted, to get more countries to take Chinese currency, to accept it, and that makes you a degree less dependent on having to earn dollars. They probably will not be able to displace the U.S. dollar entirely, but maybe they don't have to. That you just have to do it enough, and at some point when the shock comes, when you make your move, you can cause enough trouble. Say if you unload all your treasury holdings, U.S. treasury holdings in an afternoon, to cause enough of a fuss that the Americans cannot respond quickly or adequately enough. But this is something that it's surprising how little attention it gets. And it's getting a little more now, but for many years, nobody paid attention to this. But it's always been a huge vulnerability for the Chinese Communist Party. And unfortunately, They've always gotten plenty of dollars from Wall Street and the U.S. business class. So we've effectively funded our own, sort of our main enemy, and allowed them to paper over some huge fissures in their system.
Well, and actually, that's a perfect segue to my next question, because in terms of economics, the Economic Policy Institute reported that the growing trade deficit with China, it has cost 3.7 million American jobs between 2001 and 2018. And last year, we had a trade deficit of $382 billion. So, I mean, again, given this rivalry between our nations, should we be taking a harder look at our trade policies? And I also want to add on to that, should we be encouraging American companies to, I mean, decoupling is already happening, but should we be encouraging American companies to bring jobs home? Because it has been far too easy to send them overseas. And I think what it appears to me is we are financing our own greatest rival at this point.
Well, I think you've said it about as well as I can. Yes, this is crazy. You cannot. We shouldn't expect to win or to prevail if we are going to keep funding and providing the technology and wherewithal for our main enemy. And they're the ones that have called us the enemy. We've tried to sort of get China to become like a giant Canada. But they're the ones, who have declared that America is the main enemy, and have been building up a military to defeat us for a good long while now. So how we're actually going to win if we still having our business and financial classes act the way they do, that's something of a mystery to me. It would be good if we could, as I say, make it so that it's not attractive to invest in the Chinese market, the China market, the way that the people have. Start revoking China's most favored nation status would be a good start. They should not have been allowed into the WTO in the first place because they didn't meet any of the requirements that were required. They promised they would. They haven't. And that's been 20 plus years now. And the damage has been done. But it really is a great sellout, I would have to say, a betrayal by America's business and financial classes, combined with, unfortunately, a good chunk of the political class who saw that they had some short-term financial benefit from moving things to China, and for allowing China into WTO and granting it other benefits. But there's also an aspect of this that is really, it's hard to fathom, and that is the complete absence of, well, two things. One is the complete absence of human rights and liberties that we would recognize in Chinese Communist Party ruled China. And the human rights atrocities that take place, and yet American business doesn't seem to care. One recalls how they dealt with how they treated South Africa back in the apartheid era. I suppose that hypocrisy knows no bounds, but that's something that you'd think that shareholders would be bringing lawsuits against them all the time. You'd think that human rights groups and activists would be going after American companies for doing business with a country like this. But there's something even stranger, and that is that in China, the business environment is such that a contract means only what Xi Jinping says it does. The Chinese Communist Party's avowed objective is to put out of business every foreign company in China and replace it with a Chinese company. And your intellectual property, of course, is fair game. And if you're in China, you're going to lose it. So how is that responsible stewardship by CEOs, by chief financial officers? It doesn't make any sense. If you had a state in the United States, say North Carolina, where it was the same situation, nobody would invest there. In fact, they'd be teaching at business schools why you do not invest in a market like that. But the Chinese have gotten, through very successful economic and financial warfare and psychological warfare, have gotten America's elite class to think that they absolutely have to be in China. And they'll also tell you, well, the Americans will, well, it's too hard to decouple, to disentangle from China. Well, it wasn't very hard for them to disentangle or decouple Americans from their jobs starting 30 years ago. But now it's too hard to get out of China or to reduce doing business there. Well, that doesn't make sense. So we know what the problem is, but now we just have to do something about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I know that we're running short on time. So what I do want to ask about is Xi Jinping was quoted, I believe this was earlier this week, as telling his military leaders to quote unquote prepare for war. He didn't direct that at any particular rival, from what I've read, or any particular conflict even. But I'm wondering, should that be a cause for concern that a military escalation could be coming soon?
I think it should. I know that this sort of language is not all that unusual from Chinese communist leaders, and over the years you've heard similar things like this. But you have to try to weigh it in context and sort of in the broader circumstances. And I think it is genuine cause for concern. I think he has taken some steps, of course, to make China better able to handle the damage that comes of a shoot up. But also, he's done a lot to try and make China sanctions proof, realizing that if a fight starts, that China is probably going to be cut off from all its foreign trade. So there's a combination of things that do give me a lot of cause for concern here. I understand the counter arguments and different interpretations, but for me, there is something about all of this that makes my skin crawl. One thing that hasn't got much attention, but just happened the other day, is China announced it was going to start an exercise in the Taiwan Strait to basically inspect ships in the strait, but particularly ones going to and from Taiwan. I think you can see where that is leading. For now, it's just a few-day exercise, but it's a sense of a test run, really, to see how we respond, how other people respond to it. But China is going to play rough one way or the other, in my opinion.
Well, on that note, Grant, let me thank you again so much for your time today, as well as for your career of service. So again, the book is When China Attacks, Warning to America, and I'll put a link to this to the Amazon site for it in the YouTube show notes. Again, it has been a tremendous honor having you with me today. Let me close by asking, what comes next for you? And do you have any thoughts on the near term for U.S. China relations for maybe the remainder of this year?
Sure. As for me, now that the book is done and probably shortened my life by about 20 years, but now that that's done, I think I'm just going to start thinking and writing some articles again. What comes next for the U.S. China relationship? We are going to grasp at straws and hope that, well, China's finally decided to behave. China's objectives will not have changed one bit, and they will continue their efforts to dominate the Western Pacific, and with an objective of getting the entire Pacific and onward to the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean as well. I think that we are headed for a very tough time. If America wakes up and plays its hand, we've got 4 aces if we choose to play them. If America wakes up, then I think we will do very well. But if we don't change course, I'm not all that optimistic about what is coming.
Grant, thank you again so much for your time today, sir.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.